Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. A live transcript for this program is available on Zoom for anyone who would like to use it. Click Live Transcript at the bottom of the screen and click Show Subtitles. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Chief Operating Officer at the Holocaust Center for Humanity. I want to thank our 2022 Lunch and Learn series sponsors who helped to make these programs possible: the City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture and the Francis Roth and Stanley R. Schill Foundation. If you or your company are interested in being a sponsor for a Lunch and Learn program or even a series, let us know. Your support makes these programs possible. Thursday, January 27th, next week, is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. On this day, we remember the 6 million Jewish victims and the millions of others murdered and affected by the genocide of the Holocaust. Join us online on January 27th at 7 p.m. for an inspiring evening of music from composers who continue to create while imprisoned in Terezin. The program is virtual and free, but registration is required. There's a link in the chat where you can register. What a week it has been. We are faced again with the strong undercurrents of anti-Semitism that exist. Our thoughts and prayers are with the Jewish community of Texas as they try to rebuild a sense of security. Some of you might have caught the news released on Sunday of the recent investigation into a very cold case, the mystery of who turned in Anne Frank and her family after they had been in hiding for almost 2 years. Was it a zealous Nazi, a jealous employee, an opportunistic neighbor? Who is the person the world could point to and blame? Over the decades, several theories have surfaced, but using new artificial intelligence technology to analyze thousands of documents, along with a team of researchers led by an FBI investigator, one prominent theory has emerged: that of a Jewish businessman in Amsterdam who had been working with the Nazis for years, likely in an effort to protect his own family. This news makes me terribly sad. It's a harsh reminder of the complexity of the Holocaust, the desperation, the choiceless choices, the blurred boundaries between right and wrong. It's the reminder that there are no easy answers. This news is also a reminder that in the vast scholarship of the Holocaust, there is still so much we don't know. There are so many stories yet to be told. Author and historian Lucy Adlington sheds light on some of these stories in her new book, The Dressmakers of Auschwitz: The True Story of the Women Who Sewed to Survive. Lucy Adlington has written and published more than 13 award-winning and acclaimed books, both fiction and nonfiction. She is a clothes historian with a passion for vintage and antique costume. In a recent interview, she described herself as a, quote, dress historian fascinated by the stories clothes have to tell. I'm putting a link in the chat where you can read more about Lucy and see the many books that she has published. For more than 20 years, Lucy has collected antique garments, researched dress history, and shared stories of people's lives through clothes, which she explains reveals so much about culture, technology, trade, exploration, identity, and creativity. When she came across a reference to a fashion salon in Auschwitz, she was more than intrigued. Lucy is here today to tell us about the remarkable women who made beautiful clothing in Auschwitz in order to save their lives. Lucy will take questions at the end of the program. Please use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to type in questions at any time. Lucy, thank you so much for joining us today from the UK and for bringing these stories to light. It is such an honor to have you here with us.
Hello, and thank you so much for that introduction. And hello, everybody who's joining us today. I'm actually speaking to you from a farm in the north of England where I live. So it's a real pleasure to be connecting with you all around the world. Now, I have so much I want to tell you. So much to tell you about the dressmakers of Auschwitz, some of them featured here. So what I'd like to do is to give you a bit of introduction to my work, Then I'd like to introduce you to a few of the women I've had the privilege of writing about. And I'd also like to show you some garments and documents from the era. And I very strongly believe that there are so many ways of connecting with the past. And my own background, it began really in English literature. So literally looking at stories, but also as an undergraduate at Cambridge, I was fascinated by fragments of writing that had survived the Holocaust, or sometimes just words of graffiti. And to me, they were more powerful than grand works from classical Greek authors written in iambic pentameters, the little postcards that were smuggled out of camps, the diaries that were buried around the gas chambers or in bottles in the walls of barracks. And to me, these fragments, these things that we can salvage from the past, are incredibly powerful, as I know they are to many people. So my own work focuses now on a combination not of stories so much, but of history, so documents, archaeology, and that's the material culture objects, and literature too, so bringing in cultural context. But most of all, I focus on clothes. And some people might say, well, what do clothes have to do with the Holocaust? But for nearly 30 years now, I've been fascinated by those links between clothing and appearance and how we're treated. And so by the way, I'm wearing a 1940s gown. This is actually from America. I've worn it in your honor tonight. The label is Young Hollywood. It's a little bit more like middle-aged BBC for me, speaking to you from England. But what we wear has tremendous power. The way we present ourselves and how we feel about it, but how other people perceive us as well. And I hope the book will make clear just why this is so crucial for prisoners in the concentration camp system, or even Jewish people in hiding, or the Nazis themselves with their theatre of dominance. They relied on uniforms and image. So I became interested in clothes as a child, and I'm going to show you now the book that started me off. It's actually a Dutch book called Costume Cavalcade. And as I open it and flick through the pages, you can see there's page after page of illustrations showing people wearing clothes from different eras. And to me, that was just fascinating, that you could try and get a sense of what was life like for people in the past. So this gown I'm wearing now, navy blue crepe with floral leaf design, I don't know who actually wore it, who bought it, and I don't know who made it. But certainly throughout all of my career, I've been fascinated by these questions. And just behind me, you'll see some more 1940s fashions to set the scene. A lovely plum-coloured crepe dress with fabulous padded shoulders, very 1940s. And then behind it, a very beautiful floral rayon dress. You can hear the rustle with fabulous hydrangea flowers. So there's one image of the 1940s, stylish and beautiful. What does this have to do with the Holocaust? Well, like you, when I first heard mention of a fashion salon in Auschwitz, I couldn't correlate the two. How on earth do you think of fashion, these beautiful clothes, with an extermination center, a place that is synonymous with brutality, with suffering, with horror? And when I first came across mention of the fashion salon, this was back in 2008, and I was working on many other projects, but researching essentially women's lives around the world in the 1940s and what commonalities there were for women, whether in Australia or Japan or Kenya or China or the UK or US. And I saw mention of this fashion salon. There was very little information about it and just a few names. So these names were Marta, Renee, Eraina, Bracha, Katka, Mimi, Mansi, Lulu, Baba, Borishka. And at the time, I had no clue how to find out more about these women, how to find out more about the fashion salon. Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum said they had no records surviving. The Nazis, when they evacuated the camp, in fact, for many weeks before, they deliberately destroyed a lot of documentation as the Russians approached to hide evidence of their crimes and of their bureaucracy. And it was actually an amazing serendipity that led to my discovering the identities of the dressmakers in this fashion salon, and to be able then to write a history of the place. And this serendipity came about through fiction. With what little I knew about the fashion salon, I crafted a novel. I write young adult historical fiction. I love the way you can spin stories from the past. And I crafted a story called The Red Ribbon. And it was entirely fictional in the sense that all the characters were fictional. But I drew on my knowledge over the years of life in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And I crafted a novel that was very well received and translated around the world. And it was read in Israel. And it was read by relatives of the real dressmakers of Auschwitz. And very quickly, the emails started to come in. Oh, my aunt was a dressmaker in the fashion salon, or my mother was a dressmaker in the salon. My grandmother ran the fashion salon in Auschwitz. And so now for the first time, I had full names for many of the women and photographs. And you can imagine how emotional it is for someone, for a historian. You might think, excuse me, you might think you're being objective and you're immersed in archives and documents, but then to see the faces of the people that you're researching and you realize that these are people. These are people's lives and deaths. It's not objective. It's not just words. I can tell you, I wrote the book in a cold fury, really, with a lot of compassion mixed in with it and occasional touches of humor, because it has been such a pleasure to get to know some of these women, if I can call it getting to know them, when all but one, sadly, had died before I came to be in contact with their families. So photographs arrived, and as you can imagine, one contact led to many more. And eventually, I was able to fly to San Francisco and meet the last surviving seamstress of the fashion salon in Auschwitz. Her name is Bracha Berkovich, and she's pictured here. You can see her in the book, and here she is with her sister, Katka. So I went to visit Bracha, who was in very fine fettle, as we say here in the north of England, a wonderful woman speaking a multitude of different languages. And she welcomed me into her home. And it was an extraordinary time for all of us, I think, to have the opportunity to ask questions of someone, not just to browse documents or look at testimonies or look at garments. And so Bracha and I spent a lot of time talking about the fashion salon and talking about her friends. Because above all, the sense that I came away from all of this research is the solidarity, the friendships of these young women and their humanity. And this persisted after they were liberated, for those who survived. It persisted after they'd spread around the world, and it persists now in the second and third generations. So I spoke with Bracha and I began writing the book. The book came out in America in September last year, and it has been on the New York Times bestseller list for 4 months, which staggered me because I had no idea that there would be such interest. To me, of course, it's a consuming interest. But inevitably, I suppose, people want to know, how could there be a fashion salon in Auschwitz? Well, just to give you the basics, Hedwig Höss, the commandant's wife, Rudolf Höss, commandant of Auschwitz, first commandant, she lived in a villa that she called Paradise. The villa was stolen from its proper Polish owner, and she used slave labor from the camp to craft beautiful gardens. And imagine these gardens filled with roses and beehives with the bees buzzing, and there's a pergola, there are walkways, a small swimming pool, and a picnic table. Hedwig Höss furnishes the house with beautiful tapestries, with wonderful soft furnishings, with antique furniture and all the very nicest fittings. And they're all stolen. She wants to clothe herself and her family. And so she takes clothes from plunder warehouses in the main camp of Auschwitz, which is just over the wall from her garden. And she decides that she would like clothes altering to fit and clothes specifically to be made for herself and for her family. She needs seamstresses. And she calls on the work of local Polish women. Her first seamstress is a Polish Christian woman called Janina Szturzek, who comes to the house, and I tell you, Hedwig Höss does not pay good wages. Janina is, I'm not going to work here. I know you're the SS commandant's wife, but I can't work for this money. I can't live on it. And so Hedwig is looking to have all of this luxury, all of this privilege, but without the cost. And in spring 1942, the first official transports of Jewish prisoners arrive in Auschwitz, and they're women. The first official Jewish transports are young women from Slovakia. And Hedwig sees her opportunity not just to have men working in the garden, but then to have women coming to work in the house. Now, these young women from Slovakia, here are some of them. That was one of the first things that actually surprised me when I began to delve more into the lives of the dressmakers. They pretty much all know each other. And I think that says a great deal about the way connections and friendships work in camp. The concentration camps, the SS designed them to fracture people, to break bonds of family and friendship through brutality, through deprivation, through murder. But remarkably, these women defied that dehumanization, and they stuck together through thick and thin and did their best to help each other. And so that's how this core of women came to work together. Now, there's the essentials of Hedwig and her seamstresses, but the other SS wives in the camp, and I have to say that there were many SS families, not only in Auschwitz, in all of the concentration camps. The SS, they normalized working in a concentration camp by having the families come to stay too. And Hedwig Höss had already been with Rudolf in Dachau and then in Sachsenhausen before she came to Auschwitz. She was a very willing part of National Socialist ideology. And you can read about that in the book. It's fascinating, isn't it? To look into the motives and lives of elite Nazi women, not just the men. And the other SS wives grew jealous of the wonderful clothes that Hedwig was wearing. And they wanted their own beautiful clothes. And it was not unusual in the concentration camps and ghettos for SS to have their own pet tailor or shoemaker or dressmaker. But what Hedwig Höss did, and to my knowledge, this is unique, although we're always finding out more, Hedwig set up an atelier, a couture workshop in a building called the Stabsgebäude, the admin block at Auschwitz main camp. And here she set young Slovakian dressmaker Marta Fuchs in charge. And Marta was only 25 when she came to Auschwitz. She'd had her own salon in Bratislava in Slovakia. And she arrived in March 1942 on the second transport of women into Auschwitz. The pro-fascist Slovak government paid 500 Reichmarks to the Germans for each worker deported to Auschwitz on these transports. They paid the Germans to take the women. And these first transports were all single women, young single women between 16 and 40. And they were all told they were going to work. And they thought, okay, This is a labor camp, and they packed accordingly for the journey. And so they had one suitcase or bag they were allowed to take. And in researching, what they packed, it's so poignant. They're taking clothes that are very familiar to them. Perhaps they made them, or their parents, their mothers made them, or they shopped for them on the streets of Bratislava. They packed really hard-wearing shoes for work. They packed warm clothes because it was still bitterly cold in March 1942. And they packed little mementos of home and little treats and all the things that you would need if you were going away for a few weeks. So Marta then was put in charge of Hedwig Höss's fashion salon. And one of the first people she invited to work for her was this lovely young woman here, Irina. And Irina had grown up in Bratislava from a very poor family, actually. She was on Judengasse, Jew Street, Jewish family. And her father was a shoemaker, really talented, very poor. And Irina had no interest in sewing. Neither did Irina's best friend, René, who came to work in the salon. And neither did Irina's other friend, Bracha. Bracha's sister, Katka, was already learning how to be a tailor, tailoring for coats and jackets, a really, really specific talent, because Bracha and Katka's father was a tailor himself. He had his own tailoring workshop. And I cannot emphasize enough just how central skills such as these were in many families in Europe and around the world in the mid-20th century. And for many girls, you learned to sew at home, or you studied it at school. It was considered a proper feminine skill. But for Bracha and René and Irina, they had no interest in sewing whatsoever. And then finally, the other image I have here is of another Slovakian woman called Hunia. And Hunia came from the town of Kežmarok, further out from Bratislava. And Hunia, like Marta, was an incredibly talented dressmaker. And she loved it from being young. She couldn't wait to finish her day's work as an apprentice sewer and then come home and work at home. And I have a couple of documents to show you just to center this idea of sewing skills and crafts. I have a lovely book here showing Czechoslovakian embroidery designs. The wonderful colors of the silks here. And when I went to interview Bracha Berkovich, her house was still full of Slovak embroideries. And certainly for many women, even after Czechoslovakia was divided, when the Germans took over Bohemia and Moravia, there was a sense still that fashion could offer escapism. So if I can show you a couple of Czech magazines, these are from 1940. You can see incredibly stylish images. And certainly Czechoslovakia had a great reputation, international reputation for fashion at this time. And this one is particularly, I think, poignant. It shows a lovely summary image of dresses and the sun hats and a swimming costume. Do you remember knitted woolen swimming costume? It shows sunny days, it shows happier times. But the reality in Europe, of course, is far more sinister, particularly for Jewish people. And this is something that Hunia came to experience firsthand before the other dressmakers. See Hunia here. Hunia in the 1930s moved to Leipzig in Germany and set up her own salon. She loved making very original designs. And in Leipzig, she dressed the great and the good of Leipzig. Jews and non-Jews came to her salon. But of course, in the 1930s in Germany, she was witness to the growing discrimination and the growing violence against Jewish people. She was well aware that Jews were having their rights stripped away, their safety, security stripped away. And to give you a sense of how clothes can give us insight into these dark times, I'd like to show you a very pretty dress from the 1930s. So here, if you can see, it's a very pretty day dress in apple green crepe. It's got a lovely floral design on it, and it's silk crepe. Very, very pleasant, very spring summery. And you might think, well, that's nice, it's very sweet. But the dress tells us a great deal about, well, first of all, the German economy. We know that very swiftly after Hitler comes to power in 1933, the economic experts in the Third Reich are looking to divert all money, resources from civilian manufacturing into remobilization, remilitarization. And so gradually, as Germany comes into a war economy footing, civilians are feeling the squeeze. So this dress is quite skimpy, really. It has a very small rolled hem. It has very narrow seams, so fabric isn't wasted. And it has a very modest, very skimpy design, just a little bit of fluting and a bit of shearing elastic at the neck. And this tells us that we're not wasting fabrics on flamboyance, that we're not wasting resources at this time. And this is something that we can see in dressmaking magazines from the era as well. And I have this magazine here, an original magazine, and it is the Frauenwarte magazine, which is essentially, it's a Nazi women's magazine, and it has articles about how fabulous the Third Reich is, about how to be a good mother, about all the various roles that women are taking on in the Reich as men are diverted to the military. And it also has, and we can see a little here, articles about fashion for German women. The Nazis were hugely conscious of imagery, the power of images of appearance. And so for the men, you have the military appearance, you have uniforms, mass rallies, and you also have images of men with sleeves rolled up doing manual labor, you know, the idea that they are the workers' party. For women, the Nazis were very particular to create xenophobic propaganda. We don't want French fashion, foreign fashion associated with Jews fashion. We want German fashion for German women. And by German, they meant Aryan, not Jewish. So the imagery that we see in fashion magazines in Germany, and I have quite a collection, it's promoting the idea of being stylish and smart, but modest and thrifty. And with this idea of thrift, I show you a dressmaking pattern from Frauenwarte. And there are about 20 garments that you can make. All 20 garments, all pattern pieces from all 20 garments are overlaid on this one fine sheet of tissue paper. You would need to be, it's like being a code-breaking expert to decode all of the symbols and lines on here. So I hope that gives you a sense of the immense talent there is in dressmaking. It's often overlooked in histories. It's often dismissed. Oh, it's just dressmaking. It's just women's work. But there is a huge skill to it. So this brings me back to the apple green dress. This dress dates, the styling dates it to about 1939. What a year. But what makes this dress, I think, the most sinister garment in my collection is the label. And it's not a shop label. It's not the label of the person who made it. The label reads, if you can see, it's an acronym, initials A, D, E, F, A. Adefa. And you can read more about Adefa in the book, The Dressmakers of Auschwitz. Adefa was set up a few weeks after Hitler came to power. And it was a group of businessmen who decided they wanted to eliminate all Jews from the fashion and textile industry. These were Aryan businessmen. So essentially, Adefa stands for German Aryan Federation of Clothing Manufacturers. They were emphasizing that German meant non-Jews. And Adefa worked very hard in the subsequent years to tell the German populace, buy only from Aryans, don't buy from Jews. So we're all familiar, I think, with those very disturbing images of signs saying, don't buy from Jews, of brown shirts standing outside shops, deflecting people from going in, intimidating them. And it makes you realize, doesn't it, that even a simple act like shopping becomes political. As a German civilian in the 30s, do you choose to defy the Nazis and say, no, I'm going into that department store, I've always shopped there, great goods, great prices? Or, yes, I want to go to visit my milliner who's Jewish. Or do you say, oh, you're right, yes, the Jews do own all the department stores in town, that can't be right, I'm not buying from Jews, because the propaganda is so insidious. And we've seen the horrible imagery and the violent words used about Jewish people. And this is the same in the fashion industry, saying that Jewish boutique owners and clothiers pollute German women. That's the language used. So ADEFA said, only buy from Aryans. And it's not just ADEFA. All manufacturers and retailers, they make that decision. Are they going to support their Jewish colleagues, or are they going to profit from ousting them? And here now I'm showing you from the 1930s, a German knitting yarn sample book from the company Quell. And you can see that it's full of lovely, colourful snippets of yarn for knitting and crochet. But even this simple garment, this ordinary mundane item, it's part of this terrible journey towards genocide, because it actually states it's only Aryan production. So that message is impregnating every part of civilian life. And certainly Hunia, the dressmaker in Leipzig, was only too well aware of growing tensions and growing violence. So even a lovely dress like this can be saturated with anti-Semitism. Now, Hunia experienced Kristallnacht in Leipzig, and she, like many other Jewish people, was desperate to try and escape with her husband, but she was unable to do so. And similarly, the young Jewish women in Slovakia, back in Bratislava, they were very anxious not to be deported. In 1942, there were rumors of the work camps being brutal, but nothing definite. But these young women couldn't avoid their call up in spring 1942, because they were told, if you don't turn up for the train, your parents will be taken. So of course they did turn up with their suitcases, and they underwent the now very familiar journey in a cattle car, so over the border into Poland. And they arrived at Auschwitz. And you can read in the book their experiences of arrival. And one thing that struck with me when I spoke with Bracha, she talked about her luggage. And this is going to be relevant later in her story and in the history of the camp. She mentioned that she was helping her sister down from the cattle car, and she couldn't reach her suitcase. And an SS man at the station said, don't worry, we'll take care of your luggage. That didn't mean much to her at the time, but in the overall context, it's another example of SS profiteering. I've told you about ADEFA. They want to eliminate Jews from the garment trade. It's so they could appropriate their businesses through bullying and violence and theft. ADEFA achieved their aim, eradication of Jews in the fashion trade. And the fashion and garment trade was a hugely lucrative trade. There is so much money in clothing. And so they got rid of the competition. All that Jewish capital and talent, well, the talent was gone, the capital was kept. And many Jewish people were, of course, sent into ghettos. And it was here that the SS found that having eliminated Jews from economic life, they were short of workers, they were short of talents. And here the hypocrisy really hits in. There were factories established in ghettos, many, many different factories, to create, well, amongst other things, clothes and shoes. And some of them were for the Wehrmacht and the SS, but some of them were civilian clothes. And these clothes, many of the factories were in occupied Poland. These clothes were then transported back to Germany to be given to German civilians. The same civilians who'd been told, don't buy from Jews, were now handed clothes made by Jews, enslaved Jews. There were no labels saying where they'd come from, though. And so it's staggering, really, to think of the huge fortunes that were made. And I want to impress upon you that one of the drivers for invasion, for expansion, and for enslavement and mass murder was greed. It was profit. Wherever the Nazis went, they plundered, they appropriated. And this was the same for all new arrivals at Auschwitz and at other camps. All their belongings were taken. The luggage was taken to warehouses, and these started out quite small in Auschwitz, so repurposed buildings. And eventually, with so many hundreds of thousands of people arriving, bringing their precious goods with them, they had to expand the warehouse system into Birkenau, the camp extension, where there were 30 more warehouses. Extraordinary. And so many belongings were bought. There were mountains of them. The SS rode around them on bicycles, and they needed thousands of prisoners to work sorting the luggage. So when Bracha said, I need my luggage, and the SS said, oh, we'll take care of it. That's what they meant by take care of it. They stole everything in the luggage. So I could tell you so much about the experiences of the women when they first arrive in camp, and they're certainly not dressmaking at first. They're doing hard labor. They're working on construction. They're building the very gas chambers that would murder their families. But the only chance of survival they have is to get work that isn't so brutal. Construction work, outdoor labor in appalling conditions. And so these young women are able, because they're some of the first women in Auschwitz, they're able to get work in the plunder warehouses. And here they sort through these mountains of plunder, and sometimes they find their own clothes, and sometimes they find the clothes of their murdered relatives. And it's an incredible emotional thing, isn't it, to think of holding a garment, and they have to try and stop themselves thinking, who wore this? What's happened to them? So incredibly powerful. And one day, as Bracha was working in one of the plunder warehouses, Marta came in. She knew Marta. Marta was related to Irina through marriage. They knew each other. And Marta was shopping. And when I say shopping, I mean she'd come to the warehouses with a list of things required by Hedwig Höss, the commandant's wife, because at this point, Marta was working for Hedwig Höss sewing. And so the SS would make use of all of this plunder. They would take whatever they wanted. And Marta, when she came to be head of the fashion salon in Auschwitz, as I explained before, she used her connections to go and find relatives and friends. And she would say, Frau Höss, we need some more dressmakers. I know a young woman who would be very good in the salon, and she'd save another life from hard labor. And she'd say, I know someone who's really good at knitting. We can get you someone to knit children's clothes, or I know a great hairdresser for you. And then, so she invited Irina in. Irina comes to the workshop. Now, Irina wasn't even a dressmaker. She had learned to sew because Jews in Slovakia had been forbidden to go to school or to study or run any kind of business. So she just learned sort of on the sly, the black market of sewing, if you will. And so Marta asked Irina. Irina said, well, I've got a friend, Bracha. Can you get Bracha into this fashion salon? And Bracha, as soon as she came, she said, I've got a sister, Katka. She's a really good tailor. You could use her for making jackets and coats and so on. And Marta got her cousin Herta in, who was a corset specialist. And this is how it grew. And I think there was a core eventually of 25 women working in 2 rooms, a big workshop with all the modern equipment, all plundered, and a fitting room where Marta and her colleague Boriska worked. And here they fitted clothes for their SS clients. I'm going to show you another dress now. And I've realized that much as I'd love to talk for 3 hours, I probably should wind up very soon. But if I can show you this gown, it's not from the fashion salon in Auschwitz. To my knowledge, no garments survive. And if they do, how would we know? When Hedwig Höss and other SS wives commissioned garments from these young women, these Jewish women, they didn't put labels on saying made by Jewish enslaved laborers in Auschwitz, in a death camp. And you know, Marta had an order book in the fashion salon, and they took orders from, and I quote, the very highest names in Berlin. The order book is lost or destroyed. We don't know who they are. We can only speculate. But picture the young women and picture that the prisoners of Auschwitz, who were normally dressed in cast-off Russian uniforms, in a hodgepodge of civilian clothes, or in the infamous striped dresses. Normally, prisoners would have no opportunity to wash. They would have just wooden shoes. And this was very deliberate from the SS. The idea is if you make people look less than human, you can treat them as subhuman. And there were the SS guards with their uniforms and the prisoners in filth, in rags, freezing cold. The dressmakers were allowed to wear clean, smart overalls, but only because the SS were afraid of catching typhus from them. So contrast the prisoners who'd had their hair shaved, who'd had all their own clothing taken away, very traumatic, this mass stripping of new arrivals, all their things that they'd made or bought or cherished gone. They'd even had their names taken away, replaced with numbers. And then you have SS clients requesting gowns, as Hunia said, that they could not have imagined in their wildest dreams. So here, a long evening gown in chartreuse crepe, decorated with gold and teal spangles, the sort of thing that an SS wife might wear to a concert, music performed by prisoners, or to a play, which was sometimes presented by prisoners. In fact, some of the women who worked alongside the dressmakers in the admin block, they put on a Christmas show one year, and the SS said, we want to be on the front row for it. So this staggering contrast between SS and subhuman. But I would like to emphasize, and this is something you will be very aware of in the book, that although the SS believed they had dehumanized their Jewish prisoners, the really humane ones were the prisoners themselves. And under the compassion and the intelligence of Marta Fuchs, the dressmaking salon, this fashion salon, became not only a haven to save lives, but it was also part of the Auschwitz underground network. Marta herself became part of the communist underground network, and you can read about issues of sabotage and resistance and escape attempts. Some of the dressmakers who attempted to escape were successful, and some were shot and killed trying to escape. So what a contrast then. On the one hand, the glamour, and on the other hand, the brutality, the loss, the fear, the suffering. And you can read all the accounts of the dressmakers, and these are drawn from my interview with Bracha, but also from video testimonies from survivors and written testimonies and letters and even postcards. Marta and some of her friends managed to smuggle postcards out of Auschwitz. Just extraordinary. And this has been the most remarkable experience for me. I feel very privileged and humbled to have been able to piece this together, and work is ongoing. I'm still tracking down people. And so this multitude of sources gives us this very strong sense of camaraderie, friendship, resilience, and skills. And Hunia herself, I think, said it best. She said, we became a family, united in sorrow and joy. So I can't tell you too much more. I've got one more garment to show you, and I'm going to give you a short reading from the book, but you will be able to read about the SS, the clients, the work in the salon. You'll be able to read about the evacuation of the dressmakers who survived until January 45. And then I felt it was really important to look at their lives after the war, because of course, it's not all joy and cheering upon liberation. And there are some quite staggering liberation stories as well. They had the sense of rehumanizing themselves through clothes. And one of the first items that the young women sought for when they returned home, those who survived, was a sewing machine. And this one belonged to my Aunt Peggy, who was a dressmaker. You might recognize that old-fashioned treadle style. They had to start sewing again to earn a living. And for many of them, I think it had taken a lot of the pleasure out of sewing, but they still supported each other and carried on sewing both professionally and for their new families. So many of the young women found that their entire family had been murdered during the Holocaust, and even in attacks afterwards, anti-Semitic attacks afterwards. But for those who survived, the network of friendships, the reunions that they managed are really heartening for all the terrible physical and emotional trauma that they carried. So I'm going to show you one more garment, and it is the most precious garment in my collection, although it's quite ordinary, really. It's been made from a dress and turned into a suit, and it's in the, I'd say, early to mid 1950s. And here it is. So I'm showing you a jacket, nice silky jacket, very smart, brown and red and cream geometric patterns, and a pleated skirt that matches it, beautiful pattern matching on the pleats. And this suit was made by Hunia. Hunia, the feisty, absolutely remarkable woman from Kežmarok in Slovakia. Hunia, who even talked back to SS guards. She never let her spirits be crushed, although goodness knows she had reason to despair. But she, like Bracha, was an optimist. And she made this suit not for despised SS, not as a slave laborer in an extermination camp. She made this suit with love. And it was made for her niece, Gila, and it was stitched in Tel Aviv. And I went to Israel shortly before COVID struck, actually, and I was able to go and see Hunia's apartment, and I was able to meet many relatives of the dressmakers and speak with them. And Hunia's niece, Gila, donated this suit to my collection. And every time I look at it, of course, I think of Hunia's experiences sewing for the SS women in the fashion salon in Auschwitz. But mostly I think of Hunia. What a character she seems to have been. Hunia sitting sewing in her apartment in Tel Aviv, and as she sewed, Gila wrote Hunia's stories. Hunia told her stories. And so my book is just part of all of these initiatives to salvage fragments, to salvage stories, to salvage memories, and to ensure that these women are not forgotten, and that we can remember as many people as possible and honor their sufferings, honor their resilience, honor their experiences. So yes, I have Hunia's suit, and you can read Hunia's story. And I'm actually going to finish, and I will invite you, please ask questions, and do get in touch afterwards as well if you'd like to know more. I'm going to finish by reading a short excerpt from the book, and everything in the book, by the way, it's all accounted for. There are sources for all of it. This is not a novel. This is absolutely footnoted to the hilt, and so nothing is made up. No line of dialogue is invented. This is all from testimonies, and it's a small section that features Hunia feisty Hunia, who was considered an old woman by the younger dressmakers. She was a staggering 34 years old. So the younger women, they thought, oh my goodness, Hunia, she's an old woman. But she was very well loved amongst all of the dressmakers. And you know, the story of how Hunia is rescued from Birkenau is really powerful. So I urge you, if you can, borrow the book or buy it or listen to it. You can hear me narrate it on audio. And so Hunia has arrived at the Stabsgebäude, the SS admin block. And so here I read, after the initial euphoria of feeling safe in the Stabsgebäude, Hunia recognized that the younger women in particular were feeling the strain of carrying out so much work under this much pressure. The job was something they were trained for, yes, yet the tension of sewing for SS guards and SS wives was ever present. They could never forget they were dressing the enemy. The interaction between dressmaker and client is particularly intimate. And here I can show you a 1940s dressmaker's dummy, a Singer dummy with a German Pfaff tape measure, just to set the scene. So the interaction between dressmaker and client is particularly intimate. The seamstress takes a tape measure to a semi-naked body. She's aware of all the physical defects. She perhaps senses her client's insecurities and has to pander to their vanity. A dress fitting would ordinarily be quite a chatty, friendly affair as client and seamstress discuss the garment. For the Auschwitz dressmakers, these conversations were fraught with layers of tension. The SS had gone to great lengths to distance themselves physically and symbolically from subhumans, as the inmates were called. Yet here were Jewish prisoners laying hands on elite Nazi women, pinning hems, checking darts and smoothing seams. At any moment, a client might resent familiarity from an inmate, resulting in punishment or dismissal from the coveted job. One such precarious interchange took place as Elizabeth Rupert, the suited, booted SS guard in the fashion salon, strode between the rows of women working. Hunia was bent over her needle and thread in apparent submission, but she had come a long way from the days of being stripped, beaten, and humiliated in Birkenau. SS Rupert stopped to admire Hunia's sewing skills. She declared, "When the war is over, I'm going to open a large dressmaking studio with you in Berlin. I never knew that Jewesses could work, let alone so beautifully." "Not on your life," muttered Hunia, speaking Hungarian. And I think she probably swore, but that wasn't in the testimony. "Not on your life," muttered Hunia in Hungarian. "What did you say?" snapped the SS guard. "How nice that will be," came the more dutiful reply in German. "When the war's over," said the SS guard. Well, it was easy for a guard to daydream about a fantasy fashion shop staffed by obedient Jews in Berlin. For the inmates, there was a very strong possibility they would not live to see the end of the war. So just one small example of the interactions of these dressmakers, many more that you can read. And now I would like to thank the Centre once again for inviting me to speak with you today and invite you to ask away if there's anything I can help with, anything I can answer. Thank you so much.
Lucy, that was such a remarkable presentation. Thank you so much. The stories of these women are incredible, and I really encourage everybody out there to get the book and read more about these women. Really, the stories will blow you away, and their courage just is inspiring. But Lucy, we have a few questions, so in our last few minutes, I hope to direct a couple of these to you. One of them came in early on and asks, The commandant, Rudolf Höss, was tried in Poland and hung in 1947. His wife, Hedwig, was able to live out her life and died in 1989. What did the dressmakers of Auschwitz tell of what kind of person Hedwig was?
Great question. And I have written about the fate of both Rupert and Hedwig. Rupert, by the way, the night before his execution, was kept in the same basement where the dressmakers worked. Isn't that ironic? In the SS admin building, the same basement where his shirts were laundered. I actually asked Bracha, of course I was interested, you know, tell me about Hedwig. What was Hedwig Höss like? And you know what was striking is that Bracha couldn't care less about them. She did not interest herself in the SS women, and you can read more generally what she said, but she, and I think rightly, was very interested in her own friends, her colleagues, and she didn't center the SS in her memories of the time in the camp. But she did say of Hedwig, and this really startled me. I said, what was Hedwig Höss like? You dressed her. She said, nah, she'd had 4 children. Her figure wasn't so good. What a thing. So doesn't that just put Hedwig in her place? Yeah. So you can read more about Hedwig, and I was able to be in contact with one of Hedwig's grandsons, and he did not stint on his criticism of his grandparents.
So Lucy, another question here comes from George, and he asks, were there Jewish men's tailors that were active in the camps?
Very much so, and very broadly, and there were both tailors who were used informally and those who were co-opted to work officially for the SS. I originally wanted to write about tailors too, because there really are remarkable stories of, you know, the tailors' association with uprisings, for example, in Sobibor and in escapes and so on. But for me, it was really important to center this story on women, because so often women's experiences and women's skills are overlooked. And so to be able to center dressmaking and fashion, which seems so frivolous, and say, no, this is crucial to survival and crucial to humanity. It was really special. It was really special to tell the women's stories. But absolutely, there are many men, and I've heard more stories since writing this book. So many people have been in touch who survived through doing shoemaking and knitting even, and tailoring both uniforms and civilian clothes. There's so much more to write about.
So that's a great segue into my last question here for you. Are you working on any other projects now, and will there be a sequel to this book?
I'm working on many projects. I found all of this work intensely interesting, and I'm always gathering information. I have been for the last 3 decades, you know, whatever I see and read, and people are now contacting me. I'm still trying to track down, my current project is trying to track down the youngest girl in the salon, 14 years old, little Roshika. She did survive, and I'm trying to track down more information about her life in Israel. But for now, I've been so overwhelmed, actually, since the book has been published with communications around the world. It has been translated into 20 different languages. So for me, you know, I'm really trying to commit all my time to honoring these women's memories and sharing their histories. But I'm sure there will be more to come.
Well, you have brought a whole body of stories to light that I feel like so many of us have never had the chance to hear before. And I'll share with you later all the comments that are coming in through the chat of people saying, you know, my grandmother was a seamstress, or my, you know, my aunt, my mother, all of these stories. There's so many of them, and it's with great honor that we can remember them today. Thank you so much, Lucy, for doing this work.
And thank you to you and for the Center for all your work with education and the community. It has been a real privilege to join you today.
So wonderful. Well, thank you to everybody who joined us for today's program. This program was recorded, and you'll find it on our website starting tomorrow. I encourage you, if you want to communicate with Lucy, please check out her website, and you will find her contact information there. Programs like these are possible because of the generous support of our donors. If you found today's program interesting, please consider making a donation to help support more programs like this one. And you can make your donation quickly and easily on our website. You'll find a link in the chat. Please join us for our next Lunch and Learn program, which is on Tuesday, February 1st, entitled The Holocaust Through Muslim Eyes with Dr. Menaz Afridi, who will discuss her book, Shoah Through Muslim Eyes, which describes her journey with Judaism as a Muslim. Her book is based on the struggle of anti-Semitism within Muslim communities and her interviews with survivors. I want to give a special thank you to Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, who is running the technical side of the show. Also, a huge thank you to our CEO, Dee Simon, and to our entire team, Lori Werschel-Cohen, Paul Regelbrug, Julia Thompson, Morgan Romero, Amanda Davis, Devin Shire-Lockie, Katie Lawrence, and Ali Laps. Thank you again for joining today's program. We look forward to seeing you at the International Holocaust Remembrance Day commemoration on January 27th and at the next Lunch and Learn program on February 1st. This concludes our program for today.